They thought she was just another easy target, a lone woman walking home in the quiet streets of a city that had long stopped caring who disappeared in the dark. They didn't notice the way her eyes scanned the reflections in every shop window, or the faint tension in her shoulders, like a bowstring ready to snap. And in 20 seconds they would discover that the woman they grabbed wasn't prey at all. She was a predator with military stripes burned into her bones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make a cub. It was late evening in Briarford, a city where the streetlights flickered more out of habit than maintenance. Rainwater gathered in uneven puddles along the sidewalks, mirroring the neon glows of corner bars and rundown convenience stores. The streets were mostly empty, save for the rhythmic sound of boots hitting wet pavement. Ilara Vance had walked this route 1,000 times since she'd returned from overseas. To any casual observer, she was just another resident heading home from a long shift, wearing a faded jacket and a small satchel slung across her shoulder. But inside that satchel wasn't a wallet or makeup kit, it was a collection of habitually carried items that no ordinary civilian would keep. A coil of paracord, a folding utility blade, a tiny flashlight clipped to the zipper. She'd learned long ago that trouble rarely gave warning. You had to be ready before it found you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From the shadow of an alley, two figures emerged. Tall, heavy-set men with faces hidden beneath hooded sweatshirts. Their movements were sloppy but fast, and the way they angled toward her told Ilara everything she needed to know. One walked in front, blocking her path, while the other drifted behind to cut off her retreat. The space between them was a cage, and she was in the center. She didn't stop walking, she didn't even slow down. "Hey sweetheart," the one ahead of her said, his voice oily and false, "where you headed in such a hurry?" She glanced up, meeting his gaze for half a second, just long enough for him to see no fear there. He mistook that for compliance. Behind her, she heard the wet shuffle of boots quicken. The moment the second man's hand reached for her shoulder, the clock started ticking in her mind. 20 seconds, that was all she would give them. In the military, 20 seconds was enough to breach a door, neutralize a room, and be gone before anyone knew you'd been there. 20 seconds was enough to change the outcome of a firefight. Tonight, it would be enough to turn two predators into victims. Her fingers brushed the paracord in her bag. Not yet. The first strike had to be precise, decisive, and final. She felt the old rhythm of combat returning, her heart rate steady, her breathing measured. They thought they were cornering her. In truth, they had stepped into her kill box. The first move came from the man in front. He stepped closer, his grin widening, his arm reaching for her wrist. She pivoted to the side, snapping her forearm into his with the force of a swinging hammer. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed down the empty street. He cursed, stumbling, and in that same breath she spun on her heel toward the second man. He was faster than she expected, already lunging, but speed without control was useless. She ducked low, driving her shoulder into his midsection and using his momentum to send him crashing against the slick wall of the alley. The wet smack of impact knocked the air from his lungs. 15 seconds left. The first man roared behind her, charging again, but she'd already drawn the utility blade from her bag. She didn't slash, not yet. Instead she held it low and tight, letting its glint catch his eye, a psychological strike that froze him mid-step. The hesitation cost him everything. In one smooth motion she closed the distance, striking his knee with a low kick that dropped him to the pavement. 10 seconds. The second man tried to recover, pushing off the wall, but she looped the paracord around his forearm and wrenched it behind his back in a move so fluid it could have been rehearsed. The more he fought, the tighter it cinched. His grunts turned into gasps. 5 seconds. The first man tried to crawl away. She planted her boot between his shoulder blades, leaning just enough to keep him down without crushing him. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "You picked the wrong woman." 20 seconds were over. The fight was done. As she looked down at the two men writhing on the wet ground, Ilara felt the old hum of adrenaline in her veins. This city might have forgotten how to protect its own. She hadn't, and if these streets wanted to turn into hunting grounds, she'd make sure the predators never forgot her face. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the air was still heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and stale beer drifting from a nearby bar. Ilara stood over the two men, their breathing ragged, the puddles beneath them rippling from their movements. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, and music thumped from a passing vehicle, but no one stopped to see what was happening. Briarford had trained its people to keep walking. She stepped back, giving them just enough space to scramble to their knees. Her eyes never left them. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. Silence was its own kind of pressure. The second man clutched his arm, where the paracord dug into his skin, his hood half fallen to reveal a face pocked from years of bad decisions. The first man, still on the ground, looked up at her with a mix of anger and calculation, as though he was trying to work out if she was worth the risk of another try. She knew the type. The streets bred them in batches. Men who saw women as opportunities, not people. Predators who mistook quiet for weakness. "Get up," she said, her voice low but sharp. It wasn't a suggestion. They exchanged a glance, two animals silently debating whether to retreat or lunge again. The first man tested his weight on his injured knee, grimaced, and decided retreat was the better choice. Slowly, he staggered to his feet, favoring the leg, his hands slightly raised. The second man followed, his jaw tightening as if swallowing an insult. Ilara kept her blade in hand but angled it down, letting the message carry in her posture. "Try me, and you won't walk away this time. You don't belong here," the first man muttered, his voice half threat, half defeat. She tilted her head slightly. "Neither do you. The difference is, I know how to survive here." They backed away, one limping, the other clutching his twisted arm. The alley swallowed them in seconds, leaving only the faint echo of their retreating footsteps. For a moment, she stood still, listening. Years of military habit had made her ears sharp for danger, the sound of a second set of footsteps, a hidden accomplice, a rustle in the wrong place. But the night was quiet again, the rain whispering against metal drains. She slid the blade back into her satchel, coiling the paracord neatly before tucking it away. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, as though packing up after a training exercise rather than a street fight. Every movement was deliberate, precise, controlled. Then came the voices, not the thugs returning. These were different. From the far end of the street, near the flickering light of a corner bodega, two men were watching. One leaned against a lamppost, smoking. The other stood with his hands in his coat pockets, posture too straight for a civilian. Ilara's pulse quickened, but not from fear. She recognized the stance instantly, weight balanced, head scanning every few seconds, eyes sharp. Whoever he was, he'd been trained. The smoker murmured something to his companion, and the man in the coat took a single step forward, enough for the light to catch his face. Ilara froze, not because she knew him, she didn't, but because she knew what he was. That unshakable calm, that careful awareness of every detail in the environment. That wasn't just a trained man, that was a military man, and if he was watching her this closely, then he'd just seen everything. She took a slow breath and started walking toward home, pretending she hadn't noticed them. If they wanted to follow, she'd deal with it on her terms. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. She'd felt the weight of that gaze before, in places far from Briarford, in moments just before a mission went live. Only one question stayed in her mind as she rounded the corner. Were they here because of her, or because of what was coming? The streets of Briarford were a map Ilara knew by heart, but tonight every turn felt different. Every storefront seemed to have an extra set of eyes behind its grimy glass. Every alley felt like it might breathe. She kept her pace steady, resisting the urge to glance over her shoulder. The trick to losing a tail wasn't speed, it was patience. You made them think they had you right where they wanted, then you turned the ground beneath them into a trap. She passed a shuttered pawn shop, its window filled with dust-coated guitars and tarnished watches. The neon sign above the doorway flickered between pawn and own, the broken letter buzzing faintly in the rain. That faint electric hum reminded her of nights overseas, places where danger hummed in the walls before the first shot was ever fired. Her gut told her the two men from the bodega were still back there. The smoker wouldn't be a problem, his posture had been too casual, too distracted. But the man in the coat, that was the kind of stillness that came from training, and men like that didn't waste their time watching strangers for sport. She made a choice. Instead of heading straight for her apartment, she cut right onto Ironwood Lane, a narrow backstreet lined with delivery entrances and dumpsters. Here the echoes carried better. Here she could listen, and she heard them, faint deliberate footsteps, matching hers with almost military precision. She stopped at a locked service door, pretending to rummage in her bag. She pulled out a folded map, just a piece of tourist junk she kept for misdirection, and let her shoulders hunch as though she were lost. The footsteps drew nearer, then a voice, calm and unhurried, came from behind her. "You handle yourself well." She turned slowly. The man in the coat stood a few paces away, hands still in his pockets. Up close, she saw the faint outline of a comms earpiece, almost hidden beneath the collar of his dark jacket. His eyes scanned her the way a bomb tech scans a device, not just looking, but reading. "Not many people put two men down in under half a minute," he added. Alara didn't answer right away. She studied his stance, the slight lean on his left leg, an old injury, maybe. The faint tension in his jaw. He was assessing her, but she was doing the same. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said finally, "but it's not your business." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe not, or maybe it's exactly my business." Before she could respond, the smoker appeared from the shadows, tossing his cigarette into a puddle. "We should go," he said to the man in the coat. "She's not going anywhere." That told her more than their words did. They weren't random passers-by. They'd been looking for her, maybe not for tonight's fight, but for something else entirely. The man in the coat gave her one last look, then nodded toward the far end of the lane. "We'll be seeing you, Miss Vance." Her chest tightened. She had never given them her name. They walked away, their footsteps fading into the rain, leaving her in the cold hum of the empty lane. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching the space they'd left behind. She had enemies in this city, that was nothing new, but these men didn't feel like enemies. They felt like a warning, and Alara Vance had learned long ago, warnings meant trouble was already on the way. Alara's apartment was on the top floor of a converted textile mill, the kind of place that had once been cheap and forgotten, until developers turned it into urban lofts, and doubled the rent. She liked it for the high windows and the view over the freight tracks. The constant clatter of trains had a way of drowning out the noise inside her head. She locked the door behind her, sliding the deadbolt into place with a metallic click. Habit had her check the corners of the room before she even took off her jacket. The kitchen was clear, the hallway too. Only then did she let herself exhale. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer at the street below. The rain had washed the pavement to a dull shine. No sign of the two men, no parked cars idling with their lights off. No silhouettes in the alleys. Still, her mind replayed the moment in the lane. "We'll be seeing you, Miss Vance." The way he'd said it, like he already knew the ending of a story she hadn't started yet, gnawed at her. She went to the kitchen table, and slid a battered metal box from the bottom drawer. The lock clicked open beneath her fingers. Inside were relics of another life, a worn Army Ranger tab, a stack of old photos, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled 100 times too many. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a list of names scrawled in blocky handwriting. 2 of those names were already crossed out, the remaining 3 were underlined. Alara hadn't thought about the list in years. It was something she'd promised herself she'd finish after the war, not out of revenge, but out of duty. Men and women who'd betrayed their own, who'd sold lives for money or power. She had chased 2 of them down already. The others had gone to ground, until now. The second name on the list, the one underlined twice, had a location scribbled beside it. Briarford. She'd kept that note for almost a decade, never finding the right thread to pull. And now 2 trained men had appeared on the same night. she'd been forced to break cover. Coincidence was a luxury she didn't believe in. She reached for her phone, hesitated, then powered it off entirely. No calls, no texts, no traceable signals. If they knew her name, they might know where she lived, but she doubted they knew she was hunting someone too. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, not a polite tap, not the heavy thud of a neighbor in trouble. 3 measured knocks, evenly spaced. She froze, her hand hovering over the handle of the blade she kept on the counter. Another 3 knocks followed, exactly the same rhythm. That rhythm was a signal. Not military standard, something more personal, something only a handful of people from her old unit would know. She crossed to the peephole and looked. The hallway was empty, every muscle in her body tensed. Either someone was playing a dangerous game, or someone from her past had just stepped back into her life without warning. The problem was, in her world, both possibilities usually meant the same thing: trouble. Alara stayed at the peephole for a full 30 seconds, her breathing shallow. The hallway's fluorescent lights flickered once, buzzing like an insect caught in glass, and for a moment the air felt heavier, the way it used to in those narrow seconds before a breach. The signal was too precise to be random. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Back in her unit, it meant all clear, but be ready, which was the kind of contradiction you only heard in places where the air smelled of dust, cordite, and tension. She slid the secondary lock open, but didn't fully turn the handle. Instead, she called through the door, "You've got one chance to tell me who you are." Silence, then a voice she hadn't heard in over 8 years. "Vance. Open up, or I'm gone." Her hand tightened on the handle. The voice was lower now, raspier than she remembered, but she knew it instantly. Sergeant Mason Rourke. He'd been the one who'd pulled her out when the mission in Korish went bad, the one who'd stayed behind so the rest of the team could extract. She'd been told later he never made it back to base. Everyone assumed he was dead. She unlocked the door. Mason stood there, water dripping from his hood, a faint scar running from his jawline to his ear. His eyes scanned the room behind her before he even stepped inside, muscle memory written into every movement. "You're supposed to be dead," she said flatly. He gave the smallest shrug. "So are you." It wasn't a joke, they both knew it. She stepped aside, and he entered without another word. He didn't sit. Instead, he moved to the window and glanced at the street below, then at the door, then at her. "You've been made," he said finally. "They've had eyes on you for at least 2 weeks. Tonight just flushed you out." She didn't ask who they were. In their line of work, they could mean a dozen different groups: mercenaries, ex-military, turned private contractors, or something more official with deniable ties. "Those 2 men tonight," Mason continued, "were testing your readiness. You passed, which means now they'll move faster." Alara crossed her arms. "Why? I've been out for years. I'm not even a name in their files anymore." He looked at her like she'd just said the dumbest thing in the world. "It's about the list, Vance. They know you still have it." Her throat went tight. The list was supposed to be a ghost, untraceable, hidden. Only 2 people had ever seen it, her and Mason. "Unless someone sold you out," he said, reading her silence. "And now they think you're getting close." She walked to the table, pulled the metal box toward her, and opened it. Mason's eyes flicked to the names, and his jaw tightened. "That one," he said, tapping the second underlined name. "He's the reason I'm still breathing, and the reason you won't be, unless we move first." She closed the box slowly. "I thought you were gone for 8 years, Mason. Now you show up telling me we're in the middle of a hunt." His gaze was steady. "Not a hunt, Vance. A war, and you're already on the front line." The rain outside turned to a steady downpour, drumming against the windows like distant gunfire. Alara realized then that tonight's fight with the 2 thugs wasn't an accident. It was the opening move. And whether she liked it or not, she had just been drafted back into a war she thought was over. Mason didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as the metal box was closed, he started moving through her apartment, scanning for weaknesses, windows too easy to breach,
blind spots near the door, sightlines from the street. It was the kind of methodical sweep that came from years of living in places where hesitation got you killed. "You've been sloppy," he said without looking at her. Curtains drawn but not blacked out, one entry point reinforced, the other untouched. No escape route that doesn't take you straight into open street. Alara bristled. "This isn't a forward operating base, Mason. It's a civilian apartment." He turned and the look in his eyes made her feel like she'd just failed a field test. "You think that matters to them?" She didn't answer. Instead she pulled a duffel from under the bed and tossed it on the table. Inside were the remnants of her old life, a field med kit, a compact ballistic vest, a disassembled sidearm, and a roll of duct tape worn at the edges. Mason's expression softened slightly, a silent acknowledgement that she hadn't completely gone soft. "They'll come at you from an angle you won't expect," he said, picking up the vest and checking the stitching. "Not a straight hit. Maybe leverage someone you know, maybe force you to move." She zipped the duffel shut. "So we move first." His mouth quirked into the faintest smile. "That's the Vance I remember." They spent the next hour rearranging the apartment into something more defensible. Mason rigged a noise trap on the fire escape using fishing line and empty cans from her recycling bin. Alara blocked the rear window with an overturned bookshelf, leaving just enough of a gap for her to slip through if she had to. The kitchen table was pushed against the front door as a makeshift barricade. Only when they were done did Mason finally sit, pulling a folded map from his jacket. It was a street grid of Briarford, worn soft from handling. 3 locations were marked in red ink. One of them was just 4 blocks from her building. "That's where he's staying," Mason said, tapping the closest mark. "The name on your list, he's running under an alias now, but it's him." Alara leaned closer. "If he's that close, why haven't you taken him out already?" "Because he's not alone," Mason said. "He's surrounded by contractors. Ex-special forces, same as us. You go in loud, you don't come out." She studied the map. The building was an old warehouse, converted into what city records called a private security training facility. That told her everything she needed to know. They were operating under the cover of legitimacy. Mason slid a second piece of paper toward her, a grainy surveillance photo. The man in the image was older than she remembered, hair thinner, but the eyes were the same, cold. Calculating, the kind of man who saw lives as pieces on a board. She felt the familiar coil of tension in her chest. This was no longer about surviving the night. This was about finishing something she'd started long before Briarford. "Tomorrow," Mason said, "we make contact." She looked at him. "And tonight?" He glanced toward the window, where the rain was easing into a mist again. "Tonight we wait. They'll send someone. They always do." She didn't ask how he knew. In their world, patterns were as predictable as gravity. And if Mason was right, by the time the city woke up, the first counter-move in this new war would already be underway.
The city had gone quiet by the time midnight crawled past. The freight trains were fewer now, their distant clatter fading into the rhythm of the rain. Alara sat on the floor near the window, back against the wall, her duffel close enough to reach without looking. The city had gone quiet by the time midnight quiet by the time midnight quiet by the time midnight quiet. Mason sat opposite her, his posture loose but eyes sharp, a soldier's version of rest. They didn't speak much. In their line of work, silence wasn't just comfortable, it was strategic. Every word spent was one less moment spent listening. Around 2 a.m., the noise trap on the fire escape rattled, just a faint clink of cans tapping against one another. Mason's head tilted toward the sound, his expression unchanged but his whole body alert. He lifted one finger, "Stay put," and moved toward the kitchen. Alara's hand slid into her duffel, fingers closing around the cold metal of the sidearm. She clicked the safety off, but didn't chamber around yet. Noise could be as dangerous as light right now. The rattling stopped. Then came the slow, deliberate scrape of rubber soles on wet metal. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet, but they weren't rushing either. This was measured movement, controlled, someone confident enough to take their time. Mason pressed himself to the side of the window frame and peered out between the curtains. His jaw tightened. "What?" she mouthed. He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to cover the door. A shadow passed the window, just a sliver of a figure, tall, shoulders squared beneath a rain-slick coat. The fire escape groaned as the weight shifted closer to the window latch. Then, without warning, the latch popped. Mason moved fast, yanking the curtain aside and shoving the window open before the intruder could step through. Rain blew in, cold and sharp, and the man on the fire escape froze mid-step. Even through the darkness, Aelara saw the shape of the weapon in his hand. Not a gun, but a collapsible baton, half extended. "Inside," Mason said, his voice flat and unyielding. The man hesitated, then obeyed, stepping into the apartment with the unhurried air of someone who didn't think he was in danger. His eyes flicked from Mason to Aelara, reading them the way professionals read terrain. "Nice setup," the man said, nodding toward the barricaded door and the cans on the fire escape.
"You're expecting company. Guess you qualify,"
Aelara said. He smirked. "I'm just here to talk." "People who mean that don't come with weapons," Mason replied. The man's smirk didn't fade, and people who mean to listen don't barricade themselves in. He reached slowly into his coat and produced a small sealed envelope. No markings, no return address. He set it on the kitchen table and stepped back. "From the man you're looking for," he said, his tone casual, almost amused. "He says he'll save you the trouble of finding him." Aelara felt her pulse tick upward. "Why?" The man's gaze settled on her, and for a moment, the smirk was gone. "Because he's not hiding from you. He's waiting." Mason stepped forward, but the man was already moving, slipping back out onto the fire escape before either of them could stop him. By the time Mason reached the window, the street below was empty. Aelara picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, she could feel the shape of something rigid, maybe a photograph, maybe something else entirely. She looked at Mason. He nodded toward it. "Open it," but she didn't. Not yet. Because whatever was inside, she already knew it wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. The envelope lay between them like an unexploded device. Aelara turned it over once, feeling the faint texture of whatever was inside pressing against the paper. Mason sat still, watching her the way he used to before a breach, calm, silent, waiting for her to decide. She slid a finger under the seal and tore it open. A single photograph slipped out first. It was recent, maybe days old, and printed on glossy paper. The image showed a dimly lit warehouse interior, one she didn't recognize at first. But her eyes locked instantly on the figure in the center, a man bound to a chair, his face bruised, a strip of duct tape over his mouth. The second thing that fell out was smaller, heavier, a brass challenge coin. The kind issued to special operations units, etched with a unit crest she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Her unit. On the back someone had scratched 2 words into the metal, "Come alone." Her chest tightened. She knew exactly what this was. A lure, dressed as a personal challenge. The coin was a message that only someone from her past could decode, and the warehouse scene was the bait. Mason leaned forward, studying the photograph. "Recognize him?" Aelara shook her head. "No, but that's not the point. This isn't about who he is. It's about making sure I can't ignore it." She tapped the coin. "This is the hook. He knows I won't let someone in my unit's shadow die without trying." Mason's jaw clenched. "Then he knows you too well." She stood and crossed to the map on the table. The photograph's background offered clues, rusted steel beams, a distinctive row of the faded number 4 stenciled on a wall. Mason joined her, scanning the grid. "That's dockside industrial," he said after a moment. "Half those warehouses are condemned. Perfect place for a meeting." Aelara nodded slowly. "Or an ambush." Silence settled between them. Rain tapped against the window again, softer now, as if the city itself was holding its breath. "I'm going," she said, finally. Mason stepped in front of her. "You can't go alone. you know that. She met his gaze, her voice steady. If I bring back up, he kills whoever's in that chair before I get through the door. This is his game, Mason. If I want a chance at flipping the board, I have to make him think I'm playing by his rules. He studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. Then I'm not back up. I'm just the shadow that makes sure you come back. Alara gathered what she needed: the folding blade, the paracord, a compact flashlight, the ballistic vest. No firearms. If they searched her at the door, she wanted them to think she was under-equipped. It was always better when the enemy underestimated you. Before they left, she picked up the coin again, rolling it in her palm. The etching scratched against her skin, sharp enough to sting. She slipped it into her pocket. They stepped into the wet night, the air thick with the smell of the harbor. Somewhere out there, in one of those dark rusting shells of buildings, her target was waiting, not to hide, but to confront her head-on. And Alara Vance was walking straight toward him, not because she trusted the invitation, but because sometimes the only way to end a hunt was to let yourself be hunted. The docks at night had their own kind of silence, not empty, but watchful. Every creak of rope against mast, every groan of steel from the rusted cranes, carried in the damp air like whispers. Alara moved with the calm of someone who had crossed too many dangerous thresholds to count, her boots silent on the slick pavement. Mason trailed at a distance, just far enough to be invisible in the patchwork darkness. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow with a sagging roofline and walls mottled from decades of salt air. Faded lettering across the facade read North Pier Storage, Unit 4, matching the stenciled number from the photograph. A single light glowed over the side entrance, casting a narrow cone of yellow that barely reached the ground. Alara stopped just outside the light, letting her eyes adjust. Two men stood by the door, both dressed in plain dark clothes, the kind that didn't stand out on the street, but screamed security to anyone who knew the look. Their posture gave them away, feet planted, weight balanced, scanning the surroundings without turning their heads. One of them spotted her and stepped forward. "You alone?" he asked. She kept her hands visible, palms open. "That's the deal." The man gave her a once-over, eyes lingering on the absence of a firearm. Satisfied, he stepped aside and opened the door. "Straight down the hall," he said. "Don't touch anything." The interior smelled of rust, damp wood, and the faint tang of old oil. Her boots clicked softly against the concrete floor as she walked, the sound swallowed quickly by the cavernous space. The hallway opened into a wide loading area, lit by a ring of overhead bulbs that swung slightly in the draft, casting shadows that shifted like restless animals. In the center sat the man from the photograph, still bound to the chair, head sagging, the duct tape over his mouth, glistening faintly under the lights. He wasn't moving much, but the shallow rise and fall of his chest told her he was alive. A figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Time had not been kind to Major Elias Corrin, but it hadn't softened him either. His hair was thinner, streaked with gray, but the same sharp intelligence burned in his eyes. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but his posture was pure military command, straight-backed, hands clasped loosely behind him. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice carrying just enough to fill the space without raising volume. "I wondered how long it would take you." She kept her expression neutral. "You made it pretty easy." His smile was thin. Bait should be tempting, after all. Her eyes flicked to the bound man. "Who is he?" Corrin circled the chair slowly. "An old friend, or an old liability, depending on how you look at it. He knows things I'd rather he forget. And you think using him gets you what you want from me?" Corrin stopped, facing her fully. "It already has. You came, alone." The two men from outside stepped into the room, flanking the only exit. Their presence shifted the air, the invisible weight of a closed trap. Alara let her gaze sweep the space, the distance to the door, the placement of the lights, the way the shadows pooled near the far wall. Her breathing stayed slow, controlled. "You wanted me here," she said. "So here I am. Now tell me why." Corrin's smile widened, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Because you and I have unfinished business. And tonight, we settle it,
one way or another. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, a piece of metal clattered to the ground. Corin's gaze flicked toward the noise. Just for a second, Alara knew that sound. Mason was in position, and the trap was no longer just his. The clatter outside was small, but in a room wound tight with tension, it was thunder. Corin's eyes narrowed, his head turning toward the sound for only a heartbeat. But a heartbeat was enough. Alara moved. Her boot struck the nearest chair leg, sending it skidding into one of the guards at the exit. The man stumbled, instinctively reaching to block, which gave her the moment she needed. She surged forward, closing the distance to the bound hostage in 3 strides. Her blade was in her hand before the other guard could react, slicing clean through the tape binding the hostage's wrists. The man gasped against the duct tape, still over his mouth, but she yanked him down low, using his chair as partial cover as she pivoted to face the advancing guard. The first blow came from her left, the guard swinging a short baton toward her head. She ducked, the weapon cracking against the chair's wooden frame with a splintering snap. Her counter was a low, sharp kick to his shin, the kind that buckled bone against muscle. He hissed and faltered back. The second guard had recovered faster than she expected. He lunged in, arm outstretched for a grab. She sidestepped, dragging the freed hostage with her toward the far shadows. And then Mason was there. He didn't enter through the door, he came through the upper window, crashing down on the nearest guard like a falling avalanche. The man went down hard, Mason's forearm locking around his throat in a chokehold that ended the fight in seconds. Corin didn't flinch, his hands stayed behind his back, his eyes locked on Alara with that infuriating calm. "Always the improviser," he said. Alara kept moving, using the shadows and the narrow beams between the overhead lights to mask her position. "Funny, that's what they used to say about you." Corin tilted his head. "They said a lot of things." Mason shoved the unconscious guard aside, and took up position near the exit, his weapon drawn. "We're leaving," he said. But Corin didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out another photograph. He held it between 2 fingers like a poker card, letting the image catch the light. Alara froze when she saw it. It was her, but not recent. The picture was from years ago, taken during a mission that was supposed to have been classified for. She was standing in a desert clearing, rifle in hand, surrounded by a squad that no longer existed. Corin's voice was calm, almost conversational. "You walk out that door. I release this to the people who think you're nothing more than a civilian now. And then the hunt becomes global." Mason's jaw tightened. He's bluffing, but Alara knew he wasn't. The angle of the shot, the resolution, it had been taken from inside the up, which meant Corin still had connections in places they thought were long severed. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them, until they were only a few feet apart. "You dragged me here for leverage." He shook his head. "For recruitment." That stopped her cold. "I don't want you dead, Vance," he continued. "I want you working for me. We're rebuilding something bigger than what we lost, and you're either in, or you're a loose end." Mason took a step forward, but Alara lifted a hand to stop him. Her mind was moving faster than her pulse now, the gears of decision grinding against each other. She knew 2 things. Corin was too dangerous to let walk away, and killing him here would only light a fuse she wasn't ready for, which meant she had to find a third option, one he wouldn't see coming, and one that would end this game on her terms. Alara didn't break eye contact with Corin. She let the silence stretch, just long enough for him to think she was considering his offer. In negotiations and interrogations, stillness could be more unnerving than threats. Finally she tilted her head. "You really believe I'd work for you?" Corin's thin smile returned. "I believe you want to win, and I'm the only one with the resources to make that happen." She took a slow step closer, her blade still loose in her hand, but angled down. "Resources like the men who grabbed me tonight, or the ones who've been tailing me for weeks." "Field tests," he said simply. "You passed." Behind her Mason shifted his weight, restless. "Vance, don't." She cut him off without turning. What's the mission, Corin? What are you building? His eyes lit faintly at the question. A network, global, off-grid, deniable. A unit of specialists who can do what governments can't, or won't. The world's a mess, Vance. I intend to clean it up. It was almost convincing, almost. But she heard the omission in his words. Clean it up on whose terms? Men like Corin didn't build networks to serve the world. They built them to control it. Still she nodded slowly, as if intrigued. And if I say yes, then we walk out of here together, he said. And you become more than just a name on an old roster. She looked at the bound man, now half-conscious, eyes flicking between them, then back at Corin. And him. A test you've already passed, Corin said. He's free to go, or not. I don't care. That told her everything she needed to know about the man's morality, and about the leverage she could take from this moment. She sheathed her blade, and stepped into his space, close enough to smell the faint trace of gun oil on his coat. Fine, she said. But I choose the first target. Corin's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile didn't fade. You'll have it by morning. She nodded, then leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Good, because you just became mine. Before he could process the words, her hand shot up to the overhead bulb nearest them, yanking it free, and plunging half the room into shadow. The darkness was disorienting. She knew it would be, because she'd walked the perimeter earlier, and counted the bulbs. Mason moved instantly, grabbing the freed hostage, and hauling him toward the exit. The remaining guard lunged from the shadows, but Alara met him halfway, twisting his wrist until the baton clattered to the floor. Corin didn't chase. She could feel his gaze on her, even as she backed toward the door. Mason and the hostage, already slipping into the hallway. Run if you want, Vance. Corin's voice called after her, calm and certain. But when you're ready to win, you'll know where to find me. She didn't answer. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hollow space of the docks. Outside, the air smelled of rain and salt. Mason was already moving toward the shadows beyond the loading bay, the freed man, leaning heavily on his shoulder. What was that? Mason demanded as she caught up. Options, she said. He thinks he's recruiting me. That means he'll let me get close. Mason gave her a sharp look. Close enough to do what? She glanced back at the dark outline of the warehouse. Close enough to end him. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the far end of the docks, but the mist still clung to the air, carrying the smell of salt and rust. Mason guided the freed hostage to the back seat of a beat-up sedan he'd stashed in the shadows. The man was pale, disoriented, but alive, and that was enough for now. Alara slid into the passenger seat as Mason started the engine. The low rumble, barely audible over the distant churn of the harbor. They didn't speak until they'd put several blocks between them and the warehouse. Finally, Mason glanced sideways at her. You could have taken him right there. She shook her head. And what? Trigger whatever fail-safe he's got in place. Corin's not a street thug, he's an operator. You cut off the head without seeing the body. You risk missing the real threat. Mason kept his eyes on the road. So what's the play? She pulled the brass challenge coin from her pocket, turning it over in her fingers. He thinks he's baited me into his orbit. I'm going to let him think he's right. Mason's hands tightened on the wheel. That's a dangerous orbit, Vance. That's the point, she said. If I'm inside, I can map the network. Names, locations, safe houses. Once we have that, we burn it down from the inside out. And if he sees through you, she smiled faintly, then he'll make the mistake of getting close enough to try and take me out himself. They drove for another few minutes in silence. The city blurred past, rain-washed streets, shuttered storefronts, the occasional flicker of neon breaking the darkness. Finally, Mason pulled into an abandoned parking structure and killed the engine. This'll do for the night, he said. No cameras, good sightlines. Alara nodded, then turned to check on the freed man. His eyes were clearer now, but there was still a hollow look in them, the kind she'd seen in too many survivors. She pulled a bottle of water from her pack and handed it to him. "You know who that man was?" she asked. The hostage swallowed hard, then nodded. "Corin. He wanted me to find you." Mason frowned. "Why?" The man's gaze flicked between them, uncertain. "Said you'd understand. Said you'd know what to do when the time came." Elara sat back, her mind turning over the words. That was Corin, always layering his games, always leaving threads for someone to pull. It could be a warning, it could be a trap, or it could be both. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Get some rest," she told the man. "We move at first light." Mason waited until the man's eyes closed before speaking again. "You really think you can get inside his operation?" Elara's answer was quiet but certain. "I don't just think it, I'm counting on it." She slipped the coin back into her pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. Tomorrow she would walk toward Corin's network with her eyes wide open. And when she got to the center, she'd make sure the whole thing collapsed from the inside.
Dawn came in shades of gray, the kind of light that made the city look older, heavier. The mist had burned away, leaving the air sharp and clean, but Elara felt the weight of the night before pressing against her ribs. She had chosen her path, and now it was time to take the first step. Mason was already awake, leaning against the hood of the sedan with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. He didn't look up as she approached. "You sure about this?" he asked without preamble. "Not even a little," she said, taking the thermos from him for a sip. "But that's the point." He folded the paper and handed her a single sheet torn from it. On the page was a small classified ad, printed in block letters. It read, "Vance, Unit 4, Contact," followed by a set of coordinates. "Ran in the early edition," Mason said. "Corin's telling you where to find him again." Elara studied the coordinates. They pointed to a location on the outskirts of the city, an old rail yard, mostly decommissioned, with a few warehouses still in use. She could picture it in her head, long sightlines, plenty of blind corners, and enough open space to make anyone approaching feel exposed. Perfect for a meet, or a kill. She spent the next hour prepping for the encounter. No ballistic vest this time too obvious. She swapped her boots for a pair with quieter soles, and wore a jacket loose enough to conceal the folding blade at her hip. Mason handed her a comms earpiece, but she hesitated before taking it. "If he searches me, I'm burned," she said. "Then don't get searched," Mason replied. "I'll keep my distance." The drive to the rail yard was short, but each minute felt drawn out. The city thinned into industrial sprawl, the skyline giving way to rusted fencing and stretches of gravel. A cold wind funneled through the open spaces, carrying the metallic tang of old train tracks. She spotted the meeting point from 100 yards away, a lone freight container set apart from the others, its red paint faded to almost pink. A single figure stood in front of it, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. Not Corin. As she approached, the man gave a short nod. "This way." Inside the container, the dim light revealed a table set with 2 chairs, and in one of them, Corin sat, his posture relaxed, hands resting loosely in front of him. He looked like a man hosting a business lunch, rather than an operator arranging a clandestine meeting. "Punctual," he said. "I like that." Elara didn't sit. "You sent for me. What's the job?" Corin's smile was faint but genuine. "Straight to it. Good. The first task is simple. I want you to retrieve something for me. Consider it a demonstration of loyalty." "What is it?" "A package. Small. Unmarked. You'll find it in locker 19 at the East Briarford Transit Station." Her eyes narrowed. "That place is crawling with cameras." "That's why I'm sending you," Corin said. "You know how to move unseen." It wasn't lost on her that this could be another setup, not just a test, but a way to see if she'd walk into danger on command. Still, she nodded slowly. "Fine," she said. "But when I come back, we talk about the real target." "Agreed," Corin replied. She turned to leave, but his voice followed her. "One more thing, Vance, if anyone else touches that package before you do, the deal's off." Outside, the wind felt colder. She could feel Mason's gaze from somewhere in the shadows, watching. The game had begun. The East Briarford Transit Station was a maze of steel, glass and constant motion. Commuters surged through the concourse in waves, the sound of rolling luggage and muffled announcements blending into a steady background hum. Alara moved with the crowd, her jacket zipped, her head slightly lowered, just another face in the morning rush. She'd memorized the station's layout years ago, back when it was a potential exfil route, during an operation that had never gone active. Locker banks were spread across 3 levels, each one covered by a lattice of security cameras. The one she wanted, Locker 19, was in the lower level, near the service corridor. Fewer passengers there, but the sightlines were tighter. She took her time getting there, moving with the ebb and flow of foot traffic, using taller passengers as cover. Twice she spotted security guards on their rounds, and altered her route, just enough to avoid drawing their eyes. When she finally reached the lower level, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of oil and concrete dust. The lockers were a faded green, their paint chipped from years of use. She found 19 in the middle row, its steel face unremarkable. Sliding the small brass key Corin had given her into the lock, she turned it slowly, her senses tuned for anything. The faint whine of a tripwire, the shift of weight from a hidden mechanism. Nothing. The door swung open. Inside was a small black case, about the size of a hardcover book, foam-lined, sealed shut with a strip of red tape, marked only with the letters AG. Her stomach tightened. She'd seen that mark before, years ago, on shipments that weren't supposed to exist. She lifted the case carefully, scanning the locker for anything left behind. That's when she saw it, a tiny slip of paper tucked into the back corner. She pulled it free, and unfolded it. It was a photograph, not of her, not of Corin, of Mason. He was standing in what looked like a cafe, coffee cup in hand, talking to someone just out of frame. The photo was recent, maybe within the last week. On the back, in neat block letters, was a single sentence. "You're not the only one I'm recruiting." Her grip on the paper tightened. This wasn't just about the package. This was Corin's way of getting inside her head, of planting doubt where there hadn't been any. She closed the locker and moved back into the flow of foot traffic, the case tucked securely under her arm. Her pulse was steady, but her thoughts were moving fast. If Corin had eyes on Mason, it meant one of two things: he was bluffing to fracture their trust, or he was already pulling Mason into the game. Either way, it changed everything. By the time she reached the street level, she knew she couldn't go straight back to the safe spot. If Corin was watching, any deviation would confirm she was suspicious. She'd have to play it exactly as he expected, for now. Still, as she disappeared into the crowd, she slipped the photograph into an inside pocket. Because no matter what Corin's next move was, she would be ready. And if he really thought he could turn Mason against her, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The rail yard looked different in daylight, less ominous, more skeletal. The wind whistled through the gaps in the freight cars, carrying the smell of diesel and rust. Alara spotted Mason first, leaning against the sedan, arms crossed. His eyes flicked from her to the black case under her arm. "You get it?" he asked. She nodded. "Locker 19, clean retrieval." He stepped forward to take the case, but she didn't hand it over. "I'll deliver it myself." Something passed across his face, not suspicion, exactly, but a flicker of surprise. "You don't trust me with it. I just don't want extra hands on it," she said evenly. "Chain of custody." He studied her for a second too long, then stepped back. "Fine, your show." The meeting point with Corin was inside the same freight container as before. The guard at the door searched her with a quick, practiced pat-down, but didn't find the folding blade sewn into the lining of her jacket. Inside, Corin sat at the table, sipping what looked like tea. He didn't rise when she entered. "You have it," he said, his gaze on the case. She set it on the table, sliding it toward him without breaking eye contact. Intact, untouched. He peeled the red tape back slowly, as if savoring the moment. Inside the foam lining was a stack of sealed envelopes, each stamped with a different insignia: military, corporate, governmental. Sensitive data, if her guess was right. "Well done," he said. "Efficient, discreet. Exactly the qualities I value." She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "Qualities you also see in Mason." His eyes flickered, just for an instant, before the smile returned. "You found my note.
Your threat, she corrected. Perspective, he said with a shrug. Loyalty is fluid in our line of work. She didn't let her expression shift. If you're trying to turn him, you'll be disappointed. Or Corin said, closing the case with a click. I'll be proven right. She left without another word, the weight of the conversation settling like lead in her chest. Outside, Mason was waiting. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were searching her face. What did he say? He asked. Nothing worth repeating, she said. Let's go. They drove in silence for several blocks before she spoke again, her tone casual. How long were you in that cafe last week? Mason glanced at her, frowning. What cafe? She nodded once, filing away the answer, the confusion in his voice, the absence of hesitation. Either he was a better liar than she remembered, or Corin's photograph had been pure manipulation. Never mind, she said, leaning back against the seat. Just making conversation. He didn't press, and she didn't explain. But as the city slid past the windows, she knew the game had shifted again. Corin was testing them both now, probing for weaknesses, for fractures. The thing he didn't understand was that every test made her sharper. And if he wanted to play the long game, she was ready. Because Army Rangers didn't just survive pressure, they turned it into the perfect shot. 2 days passed without a word from Corin. That didn't mean he wasn't watching. Alara knew his style. Silence wasn't absence, it was observation. Somewhere out there, eyes were on her, logging her movements, noting who she met, and where she went. The question wasn't if Corin would move again, it was how. She used the gap to put her own pieces in place. Mason thought they were simply keeping a low profile, but every walk they took, every casual detour through the city, was part of her mapping routes, noting choke points, and identifying who might be tailing them. On the third morning, the tail showed itself, not by being sloppy, but by being too perfect. They were in the market district, moving through a crowd, thick with vendors and commuters, when Alara spotted a man in a charcoal coat, who seemed to blend a little too well. He turned when they turned, paused when they paused, adjusted his pace in lockstep. She leaned toward Mason without looking at him. Charcoal coat, 8 o'clock, break right. Mason peeled off toward a fruit stand, while she slowed, letting the man close the gap. When he was within 6 feet, she dropped her shoulder as if to adjust her bag, and felt the faintest brush of fingers near her jacket pocket. Pickpocket, or, more likely, a dead drop. She turned sharply, catching his wrist. His eyes widened just slightly, not in panic, but in recognition. He slipped something into her palm with practiced ease, then twisted free, and vanished into the crowd, before Mason returned. She looked down. It was a key, small, unmarked, brass. Mason's eyes narrowed. Corin, or someone inside his network, she said, slipping the key into her sleeve. Either way, it's a move. That night, she found the lock it belonged to, a storage unit on the west side, in a row of rusting corrugated doors. Inside was nothing but a single steel case, resting on the concrete, like it had been waiting for years. When she opened it, she didn't find weapons, money, or documents. She found photographs, hundreds of them. Every image was of her, training, missions, civilian life. Some taken from long distances, others from angles that meant the photographer had been close enough to touch her. And in the middle of the stack was a single photograph of Mason. This one was different. He wasn't in a cafe this time. He was in a dimly lit room, leaning over a table with Corin. They weren't arguing, they were smiling. The air in the storage unit felt colder. If this was real, it wasn't just a fracture in their trust, it was a fault line. Alara didn't sleep that night. The image of Mason leaning over that table with Corin kept looping in her mind, the edges sharpening each time. She told herself it could be doctored. She'd seen black operations fabricate evidence like this before, but the certainty in both their faces was harder to dismiss. When dawn bled into the city, she already had her decision. No confrontation, not yet. If Mason was compromised, calling him out now would only make him go deeper underground. If he wasn't, then Corin's trap was working exactly as intended. Mason brewed coffee in the safehouse kitchen, like nothing had changed. His movements were steady, casual, the kind of rhythm you couldn't fake if you were hiding something. She took her mug without meeting his eyes, forcing herself into the same easy manner. "You're quiet," he said. "Just thinking about the package run," she replied, leaning against the counter. "Feels like Corin's ramping up." "That's how he works," Mason said. "Fast escalations, forces you to keep up." She let the conversation drop there, but her mind was already tracking their next move. She would shadow him without him knowing, see where his path diverged from theirs. The opportunity came that afternoon. Mason left under the pretense of scouting a fallback spot, taking only his jacket and sidearm. Alara waited 5 minutes, then slipped out the back entrance, trailing him at a safe distance. He moved east, toward the old industrial district. Not unusual, but not on their list of pre-cleared routes either. He didn't check his 6, which either meant he was confident nobody was following, or knew she was. After 20 minutes, he ducked into a derelict textile mill. She closed the gap and edged around to a broken window, just high enough to see inside. He wasn't alone. A man stood in the shadows near the far wall, tall and still. Alara couldn't make out his face, but his stance had military precision. Mason approached him, and the two exchanged a short, sharp conversation she couldn't hear. Then the man handed Mason something, a slim black envelope, before melting back into the shadows and disappearing through a side exit. Mason slipped the envelope into his jacket and left without looking back. Alara stepped away from the window, her pulse steady, but her stomach tight. She could take the envelope now, force the truth, but she didn't. Because whatever was inside, Mason was going to deliver it somewhere, and if she followed it, she might find more than an answer. She might find Corin's real base of operations. Mason didn't take the direct route. If anything, his path felt deliberately tangled, weaving through side streets, doubling back twice, pausing in shop doorways, as if to check reflections in the glass. Either he was trying to shake a tail, or he was making sure whoever was watching saw him take the long way. Alara stayed ghosted behind him, using alleys and second-floor fire escapes to keep her profile low. Her training made the tail easy. The harder part was keeping her thoughts in check, that steady drumbeat of questions pounding at the back of her skull. After nearly 40 minutes, Mason reached his destination. A narrow brick-fronted building with blacked-out windows and a single steel door. No signage, no obvious security, but the air around it had that charged stillness she recognized from forward bases and off-book intelligence sites. Mason glanced both ways down the street, then knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more. The door opened just enough for him to slip inside. Alara waited 30 seconds, then crossed to a side alley, where a rusted drain pipe led to the roof. From there she found a skylight, clouded with grime, but just clear enough to see through. Inside was a dim windowless space, a single room with a long table in the center. At the far end sat Corin. Mason placed the black envelope on the table without a word. Corin opened it, sliding the contents into view, a set of photographs and a folded map marked with red grease pencil lines. Even from this angle, Alara could make out the shape of the location, a port facility she knew was still active. Corin studied the map, then looked up at Mason. His mouth moved slowly, deliberately. Alara couldn't hear the words, but she could read the intent in his posture. This was no casual exchange. This was an assignment. Mason didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and left. Alara slid back from the skylight before he could emerge onto the street. Her breathing was measured, her pulse steady, but her mind was now crystal clear. If Mason was running errands for Corin, she needed to know why. Voluntary, coerced, or playing his own double game without telling her. But one thing was certain, the port facility marked on that map was Corin's next move. And if she could get there first, she might finally pull his network apart. All she had to do was get Mason to lead her there, without knowing she was watching. The port was alive with movement, even under the cover of night. Cargo cranes creaked overhead, their steel arms swinging slowly against the dark sky. The air smelled of salt water, diesel, and wet rope. Floodlights cast long, sharp shadows across the maze of containers, and every echo of boots on steel felt like it carried for miles. Alara had arrived 2 hours ahead of Mason. She hadn't come empty-handed. A compact comm scanner sat close to her belt, its antenna tuned to the narrow bands she knew Corin favored. A silenced sidearm rode under her jacket, light enough not to slow her, but heavy enough to feel like an anchor. She'd chosen her perch carefully, the catwalk of an abandoned loading crane, high enough to give her sightlines across most of the yard, low enough that she could drop down fast if needed. Through binoculars, she tracked the comings and goings of the dockhands, the patrolling security, and the handful of figures whose movements didn't fit either category. One of them, she noticed, was checking specific containers in a set order, marking them with a small, almost invisible chalk X. It wasn't random. The pattern formed a shape she recognized from the map Mason had delivered, a corridor, creating a kill zone. She crouched lower, scanning for the anchor point of the trap. It didn't take long to find it, a single container, bright red under the floodlights, positioned at the corridor's center. Her comm scanner chirped faintly. She slipped in the earpiece. A male voice came through, low but distinct. Confirm position. Target will enter from East Gate. Do not engage until he's in the box. The voice wasn't Corin's, but the next one was. Repeat the order. No mistakes tonight. We end this clean. Alara's pulse slowed. So this was the play. Mason was the target. Whether it was punishment or a loyalty test, she couldn't tell. Either way, it meant she wasn't the only one walking a tightrope tonight. The east gate clanged open 30 minutes later. Mason slipped in, moving cautiously, a duffel slung over his shoulder. He looked like a man running an op, not walking into a trap, which meant either he didn't know, or he was counting on backup. Corin's voice crackled in her ear again. Positions, wait for my mark. Alara exhaled once, slow and steady, her mind already shaping the angles. She could let the trap spring, and see which side Mason fell on, or she could blow it wide before Corin gave the word. Either choice would set the tone for what came next, and whatever she decided, there would be no going back. Corin's mark was seconds away. Alara could feel it in the tightening of the voices on comms, the stillness settling over the kill zone, like the air before a storm. From her perch, she could see Mason stepping into the corridor of containers. His pace steady, his head swiveling, just enough to track his surroundings. Either he knew the trap was here, or his instincts were screaming at him. Corin's voice cut through the channel. Two shadows broke from behind the marked containers, weapons raised. At the same instant, Alara dropped from the crane, hitting the ground in a controlled crouch, and firing twice. Not to kill, but to drop the first two gunmen before they could sight Mason. The comms erupted in shouts. Mason spun, weapon drawn, his eyes locking on her. For a fraction of a second, she saw the flicker of calculation, surprise, maybe even relief, before he moved to cover her flank. Another figure stepped into the open. Corin. He wasn't hiding behind distance this time. He walked forward with the measured pace of someone who believed the board was already his. You never could resist spoiling my plans, he called out. You never could resist underestimating me, she shot back. Gunfire cracked from the far side of the yard. Mason dropped behind a container, returning fire. Alara moved to join him, and for a heartbeat they fought as they always had, back to back, reading each other without words. But Corin was moving closer, weaving through the chaos. In his hand wasn't a weapon, but the black case from Locker 19. He stopped just short of the red container, and kicked the door open. Inside, under dim interior light, was a portable server rake, humming, its drives blinking like patient eyes. This, Corin said, is the network. Every name, every route, every account. You want to burn it, you'll burn yourself with it. Mason looked at her, breathless. If we take it, we can end him. If we take it, Corin countered, you'll be hunted by every client I've ever had. You think you can survive that? The gunfire around them was thinning. Either side could collapse at any moment. Alara weighed it fast. Leave it, and Corin walked away to rebuild. Take it, and they'd paint targets on their own backs for the rest of their lives. She stepped forward, closing the space between her and the container. I've been hunted before. In one smooth motion, she yanked a flash drive from her jacket, jammed it into the rig's port, and triggered a full data pull. Corin lunged forward, too slow. Mason's sidearm was already trained on him. When the transfer hit 100%, she pulled the drive, dropped a thermite charge into the rig, and stepped back as the server's casing began to glow red hot. You just killed a decade of work, Corin said, his voice low, almost reverent. No, she said, I just killed yours. The thermite burned through the core in seconds, the rig collapsing into molten ruin. In the confusion, Corin slipped back into the shadows, wounded, but not finished. Mason came to her side. He'll come after us. Good, she said, sliding the flash drive into her pocket. Now we're on even ground. As they disappeared into the maze of containers, the night smelled of smoke and steel. Somewhere out there, Corin was already planning his next move. But so was she. Because in this game, survival wasn't enough. She intended to win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.